Good evening and welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Tonight we'll discuss President Biden's challenges in the state of our democracy. On Wednesday, President Biden traveled to Kentucky to visit communities devastated by last week's deadly tornadoes and severe storms. He promised help from the federal government.
I'm going to make sure the federal government steps up and makes sure we do every single thing. You can see it in people's faces, what they're really looking for. And look around, I say to the press. What they're looking for is just to be able to put their head down on the pillow, be able to close their eyes, take a deep breath, go to sleep, and make sure their kids are okay.
That promise came as survivors of the storms described their harrowing experiences.
It was terrifying. It was, I can't even think of any other words to describe it. It was a very terrifying experience. It looked like a landfill. That's exactly what it looked like. It just was completely demolished. It was gone.
You know, feel like you're in a bad dream. When I went down in the basement, I had no idea if I would come back out. Just got on my knees and began to pray and just pray for God's protection and pray for those that were in the path of this storm.
Just moving to hear them and so happy that those people have survived when so many have not. Joining me to discuss this tonight, Eva McKen, national politics reporter for CNN, Ashley Parker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, Sabrina Siddiqui, White House reporter for The Wall Street Journal, and Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Politico. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Sabrina, I want to start with you. We saw, of course, President Biden go into a role that he's comfortable in, which is the consoler-in-chief. What's the impact of a visit like this when you think of sort of how fractured our nation is and also the help that he's pledging for Kentucky?
Well, I think this is something that President Biden, as you pointed out, is very comfortable with, helping people grieve, that role of consoler-in-chief. And it's also more characteristic of the type of response we've seen from prior administrations in the face of tragedy, with the exception of his predecessors. So there's a stark contrast between the image you saw of President Biden kind of touring the destruction and former President Trump famously tossing toilet paper out to people in Puerto Rico after Hurricane
Thank you for
Maria.
reminding us about that.
I mean, you can never not mention it. But, and I think, this is sort of showing the way the government is supposed to work, right? Immediately deploying FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security and offering the full force of the federal government to assist. He said that, for Kentucky, 100% of the recovery costs will be funded by the federal government for at least the first 30 days. He signed disaster declarations, of course, for some of the other states that were impacted by the storms. And so, I think it was a day where you put the politics aside. It often is helpful to presidents as well, just even in terms of the optics. I mean, it's not to politicize a tragedy, but it's something that I think shows them in that role as commander-in-chief. And, President Obama with Hurricane Sandy right before the 2012 election, that was something that in the end was kind of beneficial to him going into that election as well.
Yeah, and Nicholas, Sabrina's just talking about sort of putting politics aside. I wonder, from your perspective in Capitol Hill, is there any impact to the fact that we're seeing these crazy, severe storms in Kentucky? We're seeing, of course, flooding and scary hurricanes on the Gulf. Is that changing at all sort of how people talk about climate change across the aisle, or not at all?
Yeah, it doesn't look like it's moved the needle that much on climate change. I mean, folks on both sides of the aisle are still dug in pretty far there. But one of the most striking moments for me this week with regards to the disaster in Kentucky was actually a moment of silence that the House held the same night that they voted to hold Mark Meadows in contempt. Despite all of this rancor over that, despite reading Mark Meadows' text out on the floor, right after that, you had a moment of silence on the floor where members of the Kentucky delegation got up and really thanked everyone for their support, and members then pledged their support. And you saw Speaker Pelosi then make her way and talk to those members of Congress after. So despite all of this division, there is still some point for unity.
Yeah. And Ashley, there's this point for unity. It's not, of course, he didn't go there to work on his poll numbers, but I wonder, since, of course, there is this issue with President Biden's poll numbers, whether or not the White House sees sort of trips like these that presidents often make as helping him in any way sort of message to people, to talk about sort of just his role as being a president that's trying to unite a nation.
I mean, it very well may serve that purpose, but in my conversations, I just heard no discussion of that from people in the White House. And I think if you even just watch, I was in Wilmington with President Biden when we woke up and there was all that destruction from the tornadoes. And if you just listen to him speak, he comes at this very earnestly and very sincerely. And when you listen to his off-the-cuff remarks, the thing, in addition to being an empathizer in chief and a consoler in chief, he is someone who has known deep loss and deep tragedy in his own life. And that comes through when he talks about these people. He talks about what it is like to return to the rubble, having maybe lost a loved one. And, he mentioned, and now you can't even find your kid's picture from their baptism or your wedding photos or your daughter's first ballet recital. And that is sort of immediately and naturally where his mind goes.
Yeah. And Eva, talk about sort of the impact of this on people. You, again, are someone who's been out there talking to voters. You covered Kentucky as a reporter. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was completely devastated when I saw the impact of this. I've been to Graves County. There's a popular annual political picnic in Kentucky in Graves County called Fancy Farm, and that is right in this area, in this community. I've interviewed folks there for quite some time. I remember interviewing a man from Paducah last year who he was homeless. The stress of the pandemic, him and his kids, he ended up sleeping in his car while his partner and his kids ended up in a motel. It was just devastating. And to think that this community that already so many people with so many economic challenges, there of all places to experience this type of devastation just felt especially cruel. But it was comforting to see members, this is a largely Republican district, put that aside and be able to work with the president, because they have to, right? This is one of those times where you can't be in partisan conflict when there's a natural disaster.
Yeah. I mean, the other sort of big story of the week has been COVID. It's been Omicron virus and the variant, I should say the Omicron variant, going around the country. Nicholas, Ed Wong from The Atlantic said that he canceled, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, who said that he canceled his 40th birthday party because of the pandemic. But the other thing that happened this week, apart from that canceled birthday party, was that the Trump officials, according to the House Select Committee, they were seen as deliberately trying to undermine the nation's coronavirus pandemic for political purposes. Talk a little bit about the fact that people, of course, are still living through this terrible pandemic while lawmakers are just uncovering more and more evidence about what the former president did.
Well, this is just part and parcel of that other House investigation into the coronavirus pandemic. Like, we might talk about one select committee, the one investigating January 6th, but there's this other select committee, too, that's investigating the coronavirus pandemic and has actually subpoenaed top Trump administration officials and is digging up things like this and peeling back more of quite how bungled the response actually was by the Trump administration, at least in those early days. And so, that's something there where we can expect to see more and more details come out in the future.
Yeah, and actually, when I was reading the report and sort of reading some of their findings, I was like, okay, well, this is in some ways stuff that we lived real time because we covered former President Trump together. How impactful is it, or maybe just what sort of impact might it have that this is really the House Select Committee laying out for everyone to say? There's one portion where they say that the CDC, a CDC official, sort of felt threatened and felt bad because the administration got mad at her for warning people about how serious the COVID-19 pandemic was going to get.
I think this is, first of all, I actually just want to say I cannot believe that Ed Wong is only 40. I feel like he has such a breadth of knowledge. He seems much wiser.
He's like an 80-year-old, 40-year-old.
Yeah. much wiser. But, I think this is something I think those of us who covered the Trump administration have dealt with it. We were reporting on it in real time. But then it's been a lot easier in certain ways to pull back the curtain and get more details, whether it's through the select committees or through reporters saying, I didn't have a lot of time to really go deep on that question because I got distracted by something else. So I think the impact is that it's incredibly important, right? We need to understand how the January 6th insurrection happened. We need to understand the ways in which the Trump White House bungled the response so that the country can do better next time.
Yeah. And Sabrina, just thinking about some of sort of the things that we have to understand, the report also found out that one of the briefings where health officials were giving people factual information, it angered former President Trump so much that they were blocked for more than 3 months from conducting public briefings. I remember being at those briefings saying, where is Dr. Fauci?
Right.
Where are the scientists? Now we know what happened. Your reaction to this?
We saw a lot of this unfold in real time, right? Former President Trump was routinely attacking Dr. Fauci, and he was attacking the CDC. There was so much political pressure on the nation's top health officials to kind of toe the line with whatever the White House wanted to say. And that was often, as we saw, in conflict with the science. And so it is very much the case, and it's not really in dispute, that the Trump administration's response was a large part of why the U.S. did end up being one of the leading country at one point in time with respect to cases, COVID cases, and its death toll.
Yeah.
And the way in which also that set the country back, when we go back to the conversation we were having around the politicization of it all, you cannot now turn the clock back and change the mindset of people after the Trump administration spent months, and the former president himself, ingraining in the minds of the public that masking was a political statement, claiming that COVID was a hoax, that it was all overblown. And so in many ways, the Biden administration has taken a very different approach, but they are still dealing with the aftermath of the Trump administration's response, not just in terms of the toll on this country, but the ongoing partisan politics around COVID in its entirety.
Yeah, yeah. Eva, last word to you, just a couple seconds left. You can't undo this.
No, not at all. And, I think that this issue of the pandemic response, it is going to be the administration we've talked about voting rights this evening. We've talked about the domestic policy agenda. All of that, kind of falls to the wayside if the country cannot move past this pandemic.
Yeah, that's completely true. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us and sharing your reporting. And make sure to sign up for the Washington Week newsletter on our website. We will give you a look at all things Washington. And tonight, we leave you with a note of hope among the wreckage. Jordan Bays playing the piano in what is left of his home in Kentucky. It was destroyed by last week's tornado. He told a local TV station that, quote, even in the midst of trying times, there is a peace that can be found. Tonight, Jordan and all of his neighbors are in our prayers. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night.